"System won't survive the hour," a voice said, low and almost lost beneath the hum of overlapping panic. But no one in the glass-walled conference room stopped long enough to ask who had said it. They were too busy watching numbers fall apart in real time, too busy refreshing dashboards that refused to stabilize, too busy talking over each other in sharp, urgent fragments that filled the air like static. Because 10 minutes ago, everything had been fine, and now the company's entire processing system was stuttering under a load it should have handled without blinking. And Claire Whitmore stood at the center of it all, one hand braced against the polished table, the other gripping her phone as it buzzed again with another incoming call she didn't answer, her posture straight, her expression controlled, but her eyes sharper than usual, scanning the screens, measuring the damage, calculating how long before this turned from a technical issue into a public one, because in her world, problems didn't stay contained for long, not when investors were watching, not when reputations moved faster than facts. And across the room a senior engineer was already shaking his head, saying something about cascading failures and overloaded pipelines, his voice tight with the kind of urgency that made everyone else speak louder instead of smarter, while another executive whispered about pulling the plug entirely, as if shutting everything down might stop the bleeding, and still the system lagged, froze, stumbled forward again, like it was trying to breathe through something heavy pressing down on it, and no one noticed the man standing near the back wall. Not really. Not beyond the quick assumption that he didn't belong in the decision-making space, because Marcus Reed wasn't part of the leadership team, wasn't wearing the tailored confidence that filled the room. He stood in a simple dark jacket, badge clipped low, hands relaxed at his sides, watching the same screens but not reacting the same way. His gaze didn't chase the panic. It settled on patterns, on the small inconsistencies flickering between lines of data, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes like he was listening to something no one else could hear, then opened them again and shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not interrupting, just observing as the noise swelled around him. Voices rising, chairs scraping, someone muttering about minutes turning into millions, and Claire finally lifted her hand, cutting through the chaos with a single motion that demanded silence, even if it only lasted a few seconds. "Fix it," she said, her voice even, controlled, but edged with something unmistakable, not fear, not quite, but pressure sharpened into command, and the room moved again, faster now, more frantic, fingers flying across keyboards, instructions thrown across the table without landing anywhere solid, while Marcus remained where he was, still, quiet, his eyes no longer on the people but on the problem itself, as if the panic had already become irrelevant to him, as if somewhere in the space between those failing lines of code, he had already seen the answer forming before anyone else realized what the real question was. The room did not calm down after her command. It only shifted into a sharper kind of urgency, where every second felt louder than the last. Fingers moved faster. Voices dropped into tighter bursts of technical language that sounded precise, but carried no direction, and the screens continued to flicker with the same stubborn instability that refused to respond to effort alone. While Marcus Reed exhaled slowly through his nose and stepped away from the wall, without drawing attention, not toward the table where decisions were being forced into existence, but toward the side corridor that led to the internal system's access, his movement quiet, unannounced, like he had already decided something that did not require permission, and no one stopped him because no one was looking. Not really. They were all facing the same direction, chasing the same visible problem, while Marcus moved toward the invisible one, his badge catching the sensor with a soft click as the door opened, the noise of the meeting muffling behind him the moment it closed, replaced by the steady hum of servers and the cooler air that always lived where machines carried more weight than people. And for a second he stood there, still again, letting the silence settle, letting the noise of panic fall completely away from his thinking. Then he walked forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, as if he had walked this exact path before, because in a way he had, not in this building, not with this system, but in every late night where problems did not announce themselves with alarms, only with patterns that did not feel right. He reached the terminal and logged in, fingers steady, eyes focused, scanning the data streams that mirrored the chaos upstairs but without the distortion of human reaction. And there it was, not dramatic, not obvious, just a small misalignment repeating across layers, a recursion building weight where it should have released it, a loop that no one had noticed because it looked like everything else moving too fast. Marcus tilted his head slightly, almost thoughtful, then began to type. Not aggressively, not like he was fighting the system, but like he was adjusting something delicate. Each command placed with intention, each pause measured, his breathing even. The only sound in the room besides the quiet machinery around him, and upstairs the voices rose again, someone calling out new numbers, worse numbers, projections that made no sense unless the system continued to spiral. Claire Whitmore turning slightly toward the main display, her jaw tightening just enough to show that the margin for control was narrowing, but she did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She simply watched, waiting for something to shift, while below her, out of sight, Marcus stopped typing for a moment and read through the lines he had just rewritten, not rushing the final step, because rushing was what caused problems like this in the first place. Then he made one more small adjustment, almost invisible, a correction that did not look important unless you knew exactly where to look. And only then did he press the key, not dramatic, not forceful, just a simple motion that carried no sign of what it was about to change. And then he leaned back slightly, not to admire the work, not to wait for recognition, but to watch the system respond, the way he always did, quietly, patiently, as if the outcome mattered more than being the one who caused it. Upstairs, the first change was so small no one trusted it, a single metric stabilizing where it should have continued to fall. One engineer pausing mid-sentence as his eyes narrowed at the screen, refreshing once, then again, as if expecting the numbers to correct themselves back into failure. But they did not, they held. And then another indicator followed, a lag spike smoothing out, a cue clearing faster than projected, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, until the pattern began to shift in a direction no one had predicted, and the room reacted not with relief but confusion, voices lowering instead of rising, because uncertainty had replaced panic, and uncertainty was harder to navigate. Claire Whitmore stepped closer to the main display, her phone finally still in her hand, unread notifications stacking without her attention, her focus narrowing to the data as it corrected itself piece by piece. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something underneath had been adjusted rather than patched from above. What changed? She asked, not loudly, not urgently, just precisely, and no one answered right away because no one had initiated anything new. The engineers exchanged looks, checking their terminals, retracing commands they had not given, one of them speaking up with hesitation. We did not push an update. And that was when the silence deepened, not empty, but heavy with the realization that something had happened outside the chain of visible control. While below, Marcus Reed watched the system respond exactly the way he expected, not perfectly, not all at once, but correctly, the recursive strain unwinding, the load redistributing across the architecture in a way that allowed it to breathe again. He leaned forward slightly, making one final adjustment to ensure stability held under pressure, then removed his hands from the keyboard, not hovering, not waiting for praise that was never part of the equation, just confirming with his eyes that the system no longer needed him in that moment. And when he was satisfied, he logged out without hesitation, the screen returning to neutral as if nothing significant had passed through it. Upstairs, a quiet ripple moved through the room as more metrics aligned, projections recalculated in real time, shifting from loss to recovery, cautious at first, then more confident with each passing second. One executive exhaled audibly, another leaned back in his chair as if the weight had physically lifted. But Claire did not move away from the display. She watched longer than the others, longer than necessary, because something about the correction did not feel random. It felt intentional, clean in a way that panic never produced, and she turned slightly toward her team. "Trace it," she said, still calm, but sharper now. "Find where the correction came from." And this time the room responded differently, not with scattered effort, but with directed focus, fingers moving again, quieter, more deliberate. While Marcus stepped back into the corridor, the sound of the meeting returning as the door opened. But it no longer carried the same edge. It had softened into something else, something closer to disbelief than fear. He adjusted the strap of his worn bag over his shoulder, glancing briefly at his phone as it vibrated once in his hand. A message lighting up the screen that he did not open yet, just enough to see the name. Just enough to remind him there was a world outside this building that mattered more than the one he had just stabilized, and he slipped the phone back into his pocket, walking past the glass room without stopping, without looking in, as if nothing inside required his presence anymore, while behind him, inside that room, the system fully stabilized, not a flicker left, not a trace of the chaos that had filled it less than 10 minutes before, and for the first time since it began, no one was speaking at all. The search did not take long, but it did not return what they expected. Lines of activity pulled from the system logs appeared on multiple screens, each engineer tracing backward through the correction as if following footprints in fresh snow. Except the path did not begin in the meeting room. It did not originate from any of their terminals, and that alone shifted the tone again. From controlled recovery to quiet disbelief, there was an access point. One of them said, voice lower now, more careful. Internal credentials, authorized. Another leaned closer, scrolling through timestamps. No override. No alert triggered. And Claire Whitmore watched the data unfold not with urgency, but with a kind of focused stillness. Her eyes moving from one screen to another, connecting details faster than they were being explained. Because the absence of noise in the correction mattered more than the presence of action. Whoever had done this had not fought the system, had not forced it, they had understood it. And that thought settled somewhere deeper than the immediate problem. Who had access at that level? She asked, and this time there was a pause that lasted just a second too long. One engineer clearing his throat before answering. Support level could reach it, if they knew where to look. And a few heads turned. Almost instinctively, not toward a person, but toward the idea of someone who should not have been in that space, someone outside the circle of authority. And the room did not like that idea, not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed had already stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding closed with a soft finality that cut him off from the glass walls and polished tension above. The descent quiet, uninterrupted, his reflection faint in the brushed metal surface in front of him, looking older than he felt and more tired than he would admit. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone again, this time unlocking it, reading the message fully. A simple line that did not carry urgency, but mattered more than anything upstairs. Dad, are you coming today? He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, then typed back slowly, not rushed, not distracted, just present in the small space between responsibility and time. I will be there. And when he hit send, he exhaled in a way that had nothing to do with systems or code. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the lower level, and he stepped out into a quieter part of the building, where the air felt different, less filtered by pressure, more honest in its stillness. Upstairs, the room had narrowed its focus into a single question, not how the system had recovered, but who had made it happen. And Claire turned away from the screens at last, not fully, just enough to signal a shift. Find him, she said, her voice even, but carrying a direction that no one misunderstood. And as her team moved to follow the trail beyond the data, beyond the logs, into the physical spaces of the building where answers did not sit neatly on a screen, Claire remained where she was for a second longer, her gaze returning briefly to the stabilized system, now running smoothly as if nothing had ever been wrong. And for the first time since the issue began, she allowed herself a single, quiet thought that did not belong to strategy or control, but to something simpler. Someone had seen what others missed, and had chosen to fix it without being asked, without being seen, and that, more than the recovery itself, was what stayed with her as she finally turned and walked toward the door. The trail did not end in the system. It moved outward, into hallways that carried less authority and more routine, past glass offices where conversations had already shifted to relief, past assistants who only knew that something had gone wrong, and then somehow right again. And Claire Whitmore walked through it all without slowing, her pace steady, her attention narrowed to a direction that had not been given to her, but felt obvious now. Because solutions like that did not come from crowded rooms, they came from places where thinking was not interrupted. And behind her, two members of her team followed with tablets in hand, cross-referencing access logs with employee records, narrowing possibilities into names, and then into one name that did not fit the room they had just left: Marcus Reed. One of them said quietly, as if saying it louder might somehow change what it meant, support technician, the other added, scrolling through a sparse profile that carried no indication of authority, no indication of someone who should have been able to touch the system at that level. And yet timestamps did not argue, the access point did not lie, and Claire did not respond immediately. She simply continued walking, absorbing the name, testing it against the shape of the moment, because it did not match the expectation, and that was exactly why it mattered. Downstairs, the building shifted into its quieter rhythm, the kind that lived between crises, where people returned to tasks that felt smaller now, less urgent. And Marcus stepped out into the late afternoon light just beyond the glass doors, the city air warmer than the conditioned silence he had left behind. He adjusted his jacket slightly and glanced at the time, calculating distance the way he always did, not in miles but in minutes, and whether he could make it before something small became something that mattered to someone waiting. And he moved without hesitation, blending into the flow of people who had no idea what had just happened inside the building behind him. While above, Claire reached the lower level just as the search narrowed into confirmation, the security desk pulling up a camera feed, grainy but clear enough to show a man stepping through a corridor, pausing only briefly before entering the systems room, then leaving again minutes later with the same quiet presence. No urgency, no sign of someone who had just altered the course of a crisis. And Claire watched the footage once, then again, not because she doubted it, but because she was looking for something beyond the obvious, something in the way he moved, the absence of performance, the lack of claim. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. Where is he now? And the answer came quickly this time. He has already left the building. And for a brief moment, something almost like frustration crossed her expression, not sharp, not outward, just a shift, because the moment to ask had already passed, and yet she did not turn back, did not dismiss it as resolved. Instead, she nodded once, as if making a decision that extended beyond the day. Find his schedule, she said. I want to speak with him. And then she looked once more at the screen, at the still frame of a man who had stepped in, fixed what others could not, and walked away without waiting. And something in that quiet absence stayed with her longer than the crisis ever had. The city had already begun to shift into evening by the time Marcus Reed reached the bus stop. The lights softer now, stretching long shadows across the pavement as traffic moved in steady lines that carried people home to places that mattered more than offices ever could. He stood a few feet back from the curb, not checking his phone again, not pacing, just waiting with the same quiet patience he carried into everything else, while a few others gathered nearby, each wrapped in their own thoughts, their own timelines. And when the bus arrived with a low hiss of air brakes, he stepped on without hesitation, tapping his card, moving toward the back where the noise faded into a low murmur, taking a seat by the window, watching the city slide past in reflections of glass and motion, his mind no longer on the system, not on the meeting, not on the people who would spend the rest of the evening trying to understand what had already been resolved. His focus had shifted the moment he left the building, as if there had been a line he crossed without ceremony, from one world into another, and across town, in a quieter neighborhood where the sidewalks were narrower and the buildings carried more history than polish. A small school gym still held the echo of children's voices, sneakers squeaking against hardwood floors, a few parents scattered along the bleachers, some watching closely, others glancing at their phones between moments. And near the far side, a young girl sat, with her backpack at her feet, legs swinging slightly as she looked toward the entrance every few seconds, not anxious, not upset, just waiting in the way children do when they believe someone will come. And when Marcus finally stepped through the doors, the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just a change in posture, in attention. The girl straightened, her face lighting up with recognition that did not need confirmation. You made it, she said, simple, certain, and Marcus nodded. Once, setting his bag down beside the bench, his expression softening, in a way that no one in that conference room had seen. I said I would, he replied, just as simple, and she smiled, satisfied with that, turning back toward the court as if that was all that needed to be said, because for her, it was. And he sat beside her, not asking about the game right away, not checking anything else, just being there, present in a space where nothing needed fixing, nothing needed proving. while across the city, in a high-rise office still lit with the remnants of urgency, Claire Whitmore stood alone near the window, the skyline stretching out in front of her, unchanged by the crisis that had nearly disrupted it, her reflection faint against the glass, her thoughts not on the numbers that had stabilized, not on the reports already being rewritten to reflect control, but on a single name that had not asked to be known, a presence that had entered quietly and left the same way. And for the first time in a long while, she did not reach for her phone, did not call. Another meeting did not fill the silence with action. She stood there, letting the quiet settle, because something about the way it had been handled did not feel like a transaction. It felt like something else, something she had not accounted for. And as the city lights began to come on one by one, she understood that whatever came next would not start in a boardroom. It would start with a conversation she had not yet had. The game did not matter as much as the moments between it, the pauses when the ball rolled out of bounds and the noise softened just enough for small voices to carry. And Marcus sat with his elbows resting lightly on his knees, watching not just the court but the rhythm of his daughter's attention, the way she leaned forward when her team had the ball, the way she clapped once, quick and proud, when a pass connected cleanly, and every now and then she glanced sideways to make sure he was still there, not out of doubt, but habit, and each time he was exactly where he said he would be, not checking the time, not distracted by anything else, just present in a way that did not need to be announced, while the scoreboard flickered above the court, with uneven numbers that no one in the room would remember later. And a coach called out encouragement that sounded more like patience than pressure, because at this level it was not about winning, it was about showing up, and Marcus understood that better than most, understood it in a way that did not come from theory, but from repetition, from days that required him to be in two places at once, and choosing the one that mattered more. And across the city the office lights began to dim one by one, floors emptying out as people carried their conversations into elevators and parking garages, the crisis already turning into a story they would tell tomorrow, each version slightly different depending on who was speaking, but always ending the same way, with the system holding, with the company intact, and Claire Whitmore remained at her desk longer than usual, not because there was more work to do, but because something unfinished stayed with her, not in the system, but in the space around it. She opened the employee file again. Marcus read. The same limited details, the same absence of explanation, and she studied it, as if something more might appear if she looked long enough. But nothing changed on the screen, only her understanding of what it meant, because for the first time she considered that capability did not always announce itself with titles or positions. Sometimes it moved quietly through the edges of systems and people, unnoticed until it became necessary, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, letting that thought settle without pushing it away, while in the gym the final whistle sounded, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to signal an ending, and the children gathered near the center of the court, some smiling, some tired, all of them moving toward their parents with the same simple expectation of being seen. And Marcus stood as his daughter reached him, her words coming quickly now, describing moments he had already watched but wanted to hear again through her voice, and he listened without interrupting, nodding, asking one small question that made her explain more, not because he needed the details, but because she did. And when they stepped out into the evening air together, the temperature cooler now, the sky deepening into a soft blue, there was no urgency in their pace, no need to rush the next moment. Just the quiet understanding that being there had already been enough, and somewhere between the echo of the gym and the hum of the city settling into night, two different worlds continued forward, one driven by pressure and precision, the other by presence and promise, and only one of them knew what it meant to truly hold something together. The next morning did not begin with urgency. It began with quiet decisions made before the day fully formed, and Claire Whitmore arrived earlier than usual, not because the company demanded it, but because something in her mind had not settled overnight, the building still half-lit, the usual rhythm not yet in motion, and for a moment she stood in the empty lobby, watching the reflection of the space in the polished floor, as if trying to understand how something so controlled could have been held together by someone who was not meant to hold it at all. And without calling ahead, without announcing her intention, she moved toward the lower levels, past the places where conversations had not yet started, toward the part of the building that did not carry status, only function, while Marcus Reed had already been there for nearly an hour, his routine unchanged, his presence steady in the system's room where the air remained cool and the hum constant. He worked through minor checks, not because anything was broken, but because that was how he approached everything, maintaining what others only noticed when it failed, his movements unhurried, his focus quiet, and when the door opened behind him, he did not turn immediately, not out of disregard, but because interruption was not something he reacted to, it was something he absorbed, and Claire stepped inside without hesitation. The contrast between her and the room immediate, her posture precise, her presence carrying a weight that did not belong in that space. Yet she did not speak right away. She watched, taking in the details she had never needed to notice before, the way he worked without performance, the absence of any attempt to explain himself, and after a few seconds, Marcus glanced over his shoulder, acknowledging her without surprise, without recognition of hierarchy, just a simple awareness that someone had entered the room. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone even, not defensive, not eager, just direct, and for a brief moment Claire did not answer, not because she did not know what to say, but because the question itself shifted the balance she was used to. She was not used to being asked that in a room where she held authority, and yet here, it felt appropriate, and she stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You already did," she replied, and the words settled between them without emphasis, without accusation, just fact. And Marcus held her gaze for a second, then looked back at the screen, not dismissing her, not avoiding the conversation, simply continuing what he was doing as if the two things could exist at the same time. The system was under strain, he said quietly, not explaining, not justifying, just stating what he had seen, and Claire watched him again, more closely now, not searching for confirmation, but for understanding. "Why did you not say anything?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been in the meeting, less command, more curiosity, and Marcus paused then, just briefly, considering the question not as a challenge, but as something worth answering, because it was already loud enough. He said, his words simple, his tone unchanged, and something in that answer did not confront her, did not question her authority, but it did shift something deeper, something quieter, and Claire exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in relief, but in recognition, because for the first time she saw the difference between control and clarity, between being heard and actually seeing what mattered, and the room returned to its quiet rhythm, not empty, not tense, just still, holding a conversation that did not need to be longer to mean more. Claire did not leave right away, not because she needed more answers, but because something in the stillness of that room had begun to matter more than the questions she had come with. And for a moment, she stood beside the terminal, not as a CEO, not as someone directing outcomes, but simply as a person trying to understand a way of thinking that did not rely on urgency or recognition. And Marcus continued his work with the same quiet consistency, checking, adjusting, maintaining, not performing for her presence, not slowing down for it either, just moving within his own rhythm as if it had been set long before this building ever knew his name. And after a while Claire spoke again, not to challenge him, not to test him, but because something needed to be acknowledged. "You could have called it out in the meeting," she said, her tone even, thoughtful rather than critical, and Marcus paused briefly, his hand resting near the keyboard before he looked at her again, not defensive, not dismissive, just steady. "Would it have helped?" he asked, and the question did not carry defiance, it carried clarity, and Claire considered it, not quickly, not with the instinct to respond, but with the same kind of attention he had given the system. And for the first time she did not answer right away, because the truth was not complicated, it was just unfamiliar. The room had not needed more voices, it had needed less noise, and she nodded once, more to herself than to him. "No," she said quietly, and something about that admission did not weaken her, it grounded her, as if understanding the limitation of control had opened a different kind of strength, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was settled, like something had found its place without being forced there, and Marcus returned to his work without another word, not because the conversation was over, but because it did not need to continue to be complete, and Claire remained for another moment before turning toward the door, not with the urgency she carried into meetings, but with a measured pace that reflected something she had not practiced before. And as she reached the threshold, she paused, not turning back fully, just enough to speak without breaking the quiet. "Thank you," she said, simple, direct, without formality, and Marcus nodded once in response, not looking up this time, not out of indifference, but because the acknowledgement had already been received, and she stepped out into the corridor, the door closing softly behind her, carrying with her something that did not belong on any report or metric, something that would not be documented or analyzed, but would remain in the way she listened, the way she paused, the way she chose when not to speak. And upstairs the building resumed its usual rhythm, meetings scheduled, calls made, decisions processed, all moving forward as if the disruption had been just another moment managed. But Claire moved through it differently now, not slower, not less decisive, but more aware of the space between action and understanding. And somewhere below, in a room most people would never notice, Marcus continued his work the same way he always had, not seeking recognition, not needing validation, just doing what needed to be done before anyone realized it needed to be done. And by the time the day settled into its final hours,